Hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's Object Talk. My name is Emma and I am the Engagement Officer at the Jewish Museum in London. Today you are joining me for an Object Talk on a silver salver from our collection. This object is one of over 40,000 objects in the Jewish Museum London's designated collection that shows the diversity of Jewish life and history. And our programmes exist to explore connections between faiths and cultures. This month, our theme across the museum is identity, and we are exploring objects that connect with people's identities. I am now going to share my screen so we can look at this silver salver together. Now, this week falls across the months of May and June. Our theme for the month of May was change, and putting that together with our monthly theme for June, identity, we get change and identity, a change of identity. Now, this was something that many Jewish people were considering at the time of this salver, which dates to the 18th century. It was made in 1775, just over 100 years since Jewish people had been readmitted to Britain. Before 1656, it had been illegal to be Jewish in this country, right back since 1290. Although Jewish people could live in Britain from the 17th century, they did not have equal rights to their Christian neighbours. They could not enter Parliament, they couldn't vote, they couldn't be called to the bar, they couldn't get a degree, they couldn't enter certain trades, and they couldn't hold civic offices in London. This meant that whilst Jewish people could live as openly Jewish, they did not need to convert or hide their identity in the same way as Jewish people who had fled the Inquisition years earlier. Many individuals did still choose to convert, at least in name, for economic reasons, for security. However, the object I have chosen to share with you today was gifted by someone who did not change or hide their Jewish identity, despite the difficult situation of the time. Instead, they fought for the rights of Jewish people. This silver salver was presented by Michael Solomon on the occasion of his admission to the freedom of the City of London. Gaining admission to the freedom of the City of London has been a significant event in people's lives for centuries, and it still is today when we see that honour being awarded to someone in the news. However, this salver represents a particularly important event. Solomon was the first Jewish person to be admitted into the freedom of the City of London. The freedom of the City of London, as I mentioned, is still granted today, but today it is largely ceremonial. At the time that this salver was presented, though, that was not the case. The history of the gaining of the freedom of the City of London goes back to at least 1237. It refers to the idea that people in towns were not subject to a local lord, but could instead own land and trade. And people who had the freedom of the city had certain rights and liberties. The rights of Londoners are referred to right back to the Magna Carta, where it states, "The City of London shall enjoy all its ancient liberties and free customs, both by land and by water." Becoming a freeman of the City of London gave you the right to trade in the city, then the square mile, and be part of the city's guilds, which dominated trade. To be a freeman of the City of London gave you more rights in the Middle Ages than being a freeman of any other city in this country. You would be exempt from certain tolls, you could vote in civic elections, and you could stand for positions within the city's government, such as aldermen, sheriffs, and of course the Lord Mayor. However, before 1775, the date of this salver, Jewish people could not become freemen, and so could not trade within the city within certain guilds, or play any role in civic government. A key reason why they couldn't become freemen was because to become one, you had to be British by birth or naturalisation. As I mentioned before, Jewish people had been readmitted about 100 years earlier, and since 1656, Jewish people had begun to settle in this country. However, the Act of Naturalization had been repealed in 1754, less than a year after it had been passed. This meant that Jewish people who settled here from another country, or whose parents had, could not apply, nor could their children, nor could their children. Jewish people were also prevented from becoming freemen because to become one, you had to take a Christian oath. And to even get to the stage of taking that oath, you had to be a member of one of the city's livery companies, which was steeped in Christian tradition. To this day, they are still referred to as the worshipful companies. Now, as a member of a livery company, there were different ways you could get the status of a freeman. It could be through completing an apprenticeship, by patrimony, if you were born after your father had been made a freeman, by purchase, or by presentation. Presentation is where an officer in the City of London presents you for membership, often in exchange for a service you have provided for the city. We have little information about Michael Solomon, the man who presented this silver salver. However, the salver itself suggests that he was admitted to the freedom of the city by presentation, because this salver was awarded to Charles Pearson, Esquire, for his liberal and able exhortations. Pearson was a lawyer and a politician. He was dedicated to the campaign for Jewish people to hold public offices without needing to convert or hide their identity in any way. To hold public office at this time, you needed to be a freeman and part of one of the city's guilds. Pearson was also a key figure in the overturning on the ban of Jewish people to become brokers in the City of London, and also in the campaign for universal suffrage. Although today he is perhaps best known for his campaign to set up the London Underground. In comparison to the knowledge we have about him, we have little information about Michael Solomon. We do not know his trade or further details about his campaign along with Pearson to be admitted into the freedom of the City of London. However, this was an important step on the journey for Jewish people to gain more rights and freedoms within London and without converting. And whilst he was granted the freedom of the City of London, the first Jewish person to have this right, this was not the end of the journey. Whilst he had established that Jewish people could become freemen, they still could not be admitted to public offices within the city, such as aldermen. 80 years after the presentation of this salver, David Salmons would be elected as the first Jewish Lord Mayor of London. Whilst this milestone is better known, it would not have been able to happen without the previous fight for the rights of Jewish people to be freemen of the City of London. Michael Solomon did not convert or hide his identity, and his efforts enabled later generations of Jewish people to participate in civic life in London, whilst keeping their Jewish identity. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me for today's Object Talk. Do join us again next week for another of our series of Object Talks, continuing the theme of identity.